But Prachee, great to see you
great
here
to see you.
in San Francisco on the east side of the Bay. I've been following you on Twitter, on X, a bunch. I find that my feed of scientists has reduced over time.
Yes.
Have you felt the same?
Yes. I would say yes and no in the sense that I think academic scientists have left Twitter, but I think that scientists writ large and people in industry have not. And so the nature of the conversation has changed. So much discussion about the science itself and papers and things like that. Like most of that science content seems to have moved, but a lot of our friends that are companies, things like that, are still very much very active on Twitter. I still read a ton of science. I am also very interested in the ways in which there is release of science that are not in those traditional venues, that are coming out of companies and things that they've built, often like blog posts, other things, different venues, are still very active on X. So
is that a different process of discovery?
Yeah, I try to stay on top of things and look for them proactively. I just enjoy reading a lot of that material. So X has this for you in the following feed. And especially for me, when moving from academia to industry, I did not have as big of a orbit outside of it. It was extremely helpful to try and stumble upon things and people I didn't already know.
It's, I'm interested in hearing at some point how that kind of content may or may not feed the creative process or the discovery process here at Arcadia. But before that, Arcadia is a one-in-a-kind institute. Independent research institute? How would you?
A company. I call it a company.
It's a company.
Yeah, it's a science company. So we're a for-profit company, and of course now our goals are very big, and we look very different than a traditional startup. We have a lot of runway, but we exist for a lot of different reasons to try and ask how to go about doing science in a much more efficient and effective way. So in how we do the science, how we fund it, how we communicate it, and we want to have a sustainable flywheel that allows us to really do science in the most effective way we know how, which is trying to leverage information in the universe that already exists, like leveraging evolution to try and solve biological problems like real world problems. That requires innovating on many different fronts. So it's using this opportunity to try and figure out how to go about doing science more efficiently that other people may not be in a position to do. But we are a for-profit company, and the goal is to try and say, can we actually go from basic science to commercialization in a short period of time in this building with the tools we have available today? And that's really what we're doing.
Was there a playbook when you got started, or you had to figure it out yourself?
No, of course we tried to read everything that we could on organization building and what has been tried, try to understand the meta-science principles around what makes a successful company. When you are trying to innovate, how do you spark that and not squash it? I think we were voracious seekers of data in that way. But one thing everyone told us, they said, oh yeah, you're going to start this new thing and just don't make the mistake everybody else does. And the mistake that everyone else makes is that they're going to learn a lot in this early stage of building. There's such a steep growth curve there. And no one ever talks about what happened during that period and what the learnings were. So don't do that. Make sure you don't make that mistake where you don't share what you're learning or you don't document what you're learning, because that's gold. And we said, we're definitely not going to make that mistake. And sure enough, of course we did. You head down, you're trying to figure things out, and you're focused on the goal. And like last on your mind is, let me make sure that all of this, like the meta learnings are captured. And even though no matter how badly we want to do that, because we want not just us, but everyone else to benefit from that, it's just, there's just a lot going on.
Open science is a big principle of how you run, right?
Absolutely, yes. Central to what we're doing here, and it's both for, open science is better science, rigorous, faster, all of those things. But it's also very pragmatic. All the good ideas don't live in this building, they live wherever they live. And for us to maximize what we're able to do, it's going to take all of us as a scientific ecosystem to solve the hardest problems. This idea that open science and commercialization are at odds with one another is something we want to challenge, to say, look, these are synergistic. It's really hard to make money as a company. The vast majority of our activities upstream of getting to that point, especially since we're starting from this very basic science starting point, most of that stuff is going to be of greater value to the universe than it is going to be for us to generate revenue. Our work will get better by virtue of having that conversation with others, and we'll be able to move more quickly because the things we release, now others can act on it. Now the new reality is others have acted on and not just what we were able to personally do ourselves. So to me, it's extremely pragmatic, and it has the greatest opportunity to have the broadest impact. For every research dollar we spend will have better outcomes and more impact if we share that information. It's a requirement that we have of all of our scientists to put out what they do, not on the units that you would think like scientific papers.
What are the metrics?
There's two bars that we would say. If it's useful to somebody else, we should release it. If it's something that we need feedback on, that we don't want to just be in a bubble about, we should release it. Knowing that's what we're going to do, we structure our science differently. If you know you're going to share it anyway, then you operate differently throughout that process. And you say, oh, I know I'm going to release this. So let me be kind to my future self and say, let's make sure I have all the metadata. Let's make sure that all my code is cleaned up along the way so that at any moment we can flip it open and it's not a big lift. So it's made it much more streamlined, helped us document it, gives you better ground truth. It's easier to communicate with others internally. It has all of these side benefits, right, that make a perfect sense if you operate in this way. But also we want to make sure that when we share something, these are not advertisements. We're not hyping our science. We're saying it's science. So we want the data, the code, the protocols, everything to be publicly available the moment that we put something on the internet, published on our own platform.
This is very different from what you were prior. You were a PI in traditional academia.
Yes.
And so
it's quite different.
Yeah, the mindset there is very different. So this would be on Sandbox, which is the platform through which we're open sourcing a whole bunch of
I love it.
Knowledge for scientists, mainly to help them with their career choices. So there are a whole range of researchers who are just about to start their career as PIs, putting their pieces together, or others that would like to become PI, but maybe they find inspiration in your work, and maybe they can find funding like you have. So what do you think? We talked about the open mindset and the fact of creating collaborations. What do you sense is the main difference of what can be achieved in such an ecosystem as opposed to what you can achieve as a well-funded PI with 5-year budget?
I find there's so many differences. There are as many ways to do science as there are scientists. When I was a PI in academia, I did feel a lot of freedom in being able to decide how I wanted to do the science. I pre-printed every paper out of my lab. We had open feedback from everyone. Like sometimes the fourth version of that preprint is something we would send to a journal and forget about it. But that was just like, this is how I wanted to operate my lab, and we did it because you could really do it whatever way you want. And if you try to convince people or try to tell them like, hey, you can do whatever you want, they'll say, yeah, but I can't because the system, the incentives, the whatever. It never really operated that way. And I think that there is a lot of freedom to do that. And I hope and wish that anyone who does choose that other path takes advantage of those freedoms. And you're going to get a lot of noise and a lot of people and saying, oh yeah, at this institution we want you to do this and we want you to publish these fancy papers and whatever other thing. To me it was like, look, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do science in the way that I think it needs to be done, and then I will find the places that actually value that thing and be very transparent about what that is. So when I was choosing institutions as an academic, I did move my lab after getting tenure. I moved the lab to a different place, and I basically...
You've been to a bunch of different...
I've been to a lot of places.
East, West Coast, Midwest.
I've lived in every contiguous time zone in the US, actually.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, that's
okay,
right. Wow. But I basically went and said, it was like an obnoxious version of myself, and said like, hey, this is how I do science. This is what I care about. Then they were like, yeah, we want you to come join. And I'm like, oh, that's a signal to me that this is a place that actually values the things I value and wants to operate in this way. Now, it doesn't feel always like you have that much choice because there's a lot of people and there are very few jobs. But to me, if you're going to do that job for the rest of your life, you can't, if you try to become someone else in order to get that job, you're going to be stuck doing that way for the rest of your life.
And eventually it becomes just your mindset. And
and I do think that it's like extremely slippery slope. I've seen people go down that path and say, this is just how it is, especially in science. The reason they like it is the autonomy and the ability to do what they want, but not in the way they do it, which I don't understand. It's like you can't actually do both of those things. So anyways, I would say Arcadia is pretty aggressively, and I say this sometimes almost for shock value, but it's also true, anti-credit. This is not about any one of us individually. Everyone who is here at this company is here because of something that's bigger than us. And I deeply appreciate and recognize the sacrifice. These people are amazing. They could be doing something else. They're doing this because they believe in it. They believe that we have an opportunity to make a difference and chart a path that other people are not able to do. That means that we're all here for something that's not about anyone's individual thing. And I do think in an academic science, it is very much about like building a reputation for yourself so that you can continue. And it could be for all sorts of reasons that might be noble, like so that you can survive in this system and get research funding so that you can do interesting science and fund your students and all of these things. But at its core, it is very individual focused.
You say funding, and granted that this opportunity, you created it. How many other organizations are out there how possible it is for...
Well, this is one of the things one of the reasons we are doing what we are doing is to actually grow the pie. If you think about how things were traditionally segregated with basic science being done in the academic sector, and then you want to do translational science in the private sector, and fundamentally that's actually an efficient way to find really big important discoveries, and that will be very useful. If we try to shift that mindset to say, look, instead of just doing the most obvious last step translational thing in the private sector, if we can demonstrate that it is possible, not in many decades and hundreds of scientists and with a whole lot of luck, bridging that gap from that basic science to commercialization, if we can ask better questions, answer them more efficiently, and shrink that time scale and have more effective outcomes, then maybe the investment that goes into this will increase. So you don't have to have deep pockets in order to experiment with how to do science. We want it to be so that anyone, anywhere with good ideas and wants to take those chances to figure out how to do this can do it. So that's one of the motivations for me to say, can we actually find a model that grows the pie of investment in the private sector? People to think, wait a second, this does seem like early stage, but it doesn't mean that's a really risky bet. It might be the better bet. It's possible to do this now that we've seen it happen. So I'm hoping that by virtue of doing this, we can change the mindset of where that money goes and get increased attention and interest so that many more people can raise money to do different types of science.
Yeah, one big challenge that we face as operators and investors in science is dealing with universities and their legacy like mindsets and infrastructure. And at some point, sometimes it feels like you're trying to fix something that it's broken, it's so legacy that you might as well start from scratch. Do you sense that this is what you are developing here? It's almost
I feel, in some cases, it does feel like when you have to take on the baggage of all your priors, it's like you said, that's the other thing that may be big difference is like the consensus thinking, like there is also that mindset that it's better if everybody weighs in. And I actually just don't believe that. If you want to move to the leading edge of a distribution, you can't take a poll of the status quo. Guess what? You're going to be able to move just ever so slightly if you have to get everybody on board, including the people who don't want things to change. And that's why it felt so appealing to me to say, look, I don't want to convince people that we should try and do things differently. I just want to do it. And by virtue of doing it and making it exist in the real world, now that thing is part of people's reality and the Overton window has shifted.
How long did it take you, or maybe it was immediate, or maybe you never had it, but did you ever had a sense of judgment from your ex-colleagues and the institution where you were at?
Oh yeah.
Going, she's crazy, or she's gone berserk.
I would say that my colleagues were extremely generous and nice to my face. And of course you hear things from people like side channels, and it sounds crazy because it was crazy. I had just moved my lab there, and it sounds crazy because it was one of those situations where things were just on the up and I had a lot of funding, and this was all pull and not push. At the time I was like, this is great, but this feels like an unprecedented opportunity to do something. And I had spent my academic life doing a lot of things that I thought would be good for science, and in a lot of different positions where I had leadership positions where I had an opportunity to try and move the needle, but it just felt like convincing people and persuading people. It just felt so hard to move. And it was like, oh, if we just plant the seed and say this is possible, then building with people who are willing. If we can, and I believe a lot also, especially in the young generation who don't have all the baggage and don't have these assumptions of how it can and cannot be because they don't have all of that weighing on them, right? And I always found them to be very persuadable and also just open-minded. I just had this optimism about that group of people that if we just say it could be different and they are aligned and willing to go try it, then things can shift, and they can shift quickly. Even though academia is a very long time scales and many people are doing that for the many decades of their life, there is a huge influx, and there's always people coming in, and their reality can be different. I experienced that myself in my academic life. In my own research lab, we would preprint everything that we did, and then we would get that feedback. And I remember one of my graduate students, it was one of our very last meetings before she defended her thesis, and her paper was off at the journal after we had done all of the actual work and talked to 1 million people about it. And I said, back in the day, we used to send things off to these journals, and it would be like nerve-wracking because we didn't know what would come back. And she said, oh, that sounds horrible. And it was hilarious because that's how everybody operates still. But her reality was different. This was just a person her only reality was in my lab, and we did it this other way. And her entire universe was different than the actual universe.
Is that a particular character or mindset that is congenital. So not every researcher could flip to this world.
Yeah.
But do you think there's a specific profile of a researcher that would fit well within this world?
I'm an optimist. I actually hope that this is a thing that many times people just, maybe they wouldn't have come up with that, but when they see it, they like it. I'm an early adopter. I think that might be an intrinsic thing, where you just are willing to try things, and or the barrier to switching is not so high for me.
Your role now has shifted from being, in effect, an entrepreneur, co-founder of a company.
Yeah.
Your CSO, is there any parallel to the work that you were doing as a PI, in the sense that you have different research projects happening that hopefully will create companies?
Yeah.
And are you supervising the science like you would have
Not
back
at
in the
all.
lab,
Yeah.
or you're more
It's very
like
different.
coordinating?
Yeah, it's very different. So I think when we started out, I was like much more involved on many more of the projects. There weren't that many people here. And so now that we're at this size, we're about 45 people-ish. Now that we're at this size, a lot of my time is spent more on scientific strategy, and there's areas of the science that I'm involved in thinking about the science all across the org. And so there's definitely a lot of science discussions I have. I'm reading and thinking a lot about the science itself, but it's not the situation like in my own lab where it was like, okay, these are the projects and we're outlining them, and I'm involved in every project that's going on here, and I supervise some of these projects, but it's definitely not the same type of job at all. It's really exciting, and it's really fun.
Are you looking for KPIs that are more company-like, or do the groups or the teams have a bit more
different.
That moving like companies, but a bit more leeway in terms of the timing and the budgets?
Yeah, one thing that it's helpful is that part of it is the nature of this company, which is that we are not building a product.
Yeah.
We are building companies. And from individual projects that are very much started by the scientists, but we have different divisions of science that are going on here. Part of it is the discovery science, which is when I say, oh yeah, we're going to leverage evolution to solve biological problems. What does that mean? What does that actually mean? Like building the tools and technologies it takes us to be able to rationally mine the tree of life, to land somewhere that would make sense to land on, and then try to be able to interrogate that biology. If we land anywhere, like how are we going to study that? So we also build the technologies to be able to do that. And so there's part of the organizations that's doing that work of the methods development, the computational pipelines, the moving the science needle on how much can we squeeze out of the data to make better decisions. So there's that part of the organization that is doing that. Essentially, it's like building platform technologies. We have a part of the organization that does that type of science. And then there's part of the organization that says, look, okay, we've got these things, we can make these predictions on what are the things to go after, but then we have to
That's the
actually
intelligence or the material that you consume, looking for what are you looking for signals? What are you
Yeah, so we're looking for all
scouting
sorts of things. We have decided to focus our company now for therapeutics development, right? For that purpose, there's a lot of different biological questions that would come up, like looking for novel targets for different therapies, looking for novel assets, which might be for different companies, could be small molecules. For us, we're focusing first on biologics and protein peptide-based biologics. And then also finding the right types of assays so that when you do investigate whether or not you're having some therapeutic value, it's much more relevant to human biology, and that downstream the clinical trials won't fail, right? We're innovating on all of those different fronts. So we have the type of science that does that, which is like, how do we actually build in that thinking to try and do therapeutics development better, but then we also have to validate those predictions. So we also have scientists that are doing research projects that are like, okay, now we have this leg up of trying to do things in this different way. Let's test that and see if we can actually come up with therapies or assets or assays and things that would be something that is of value as a company that we can actually spin out. As you can imagine, all these different approaches that we come up with that should help our companies be more successful might also help other companies be more successful. Our goal is sustainability and just profitability, to try and get this to be a flywheel that can sustain our research and get more of it to happen. So we are thinking about what are the different ways. We do have this spin out model to get these companies to start in-house and spin out, where we would have equity in those, and hopefully if they go on to make revenue, helps us make us self-sustaining. But we also want to, if there's value in partnering with other companies and other things that might be like, we can solve a problem for you that you don't want to solve yourself, that we might be able to do some development for them in various capacities. So we're exploring a lot of these various different things. But
that's a great thing of having the freedom to...
It's amazing. We can actually reinvent ourselves. Sometimes I say we're iteration 6,000 of this company. And we're always constantly shifting those things to try and figure that out. You can imagine our scientists come in and say, okay, they're all bringing something to the table, their expertise, and they're coming up with these ideas, right? And then I'm trying to see which of these things makes sense in our cohesive goal,
Yeah.
where all of us are working together towards the thing, and it's not just all going in different directions, right?
I see. What's the experience like for whoever is coming on board? So in effect, you're going around academia, I would imagine, or existing companies?
Because we came from academia,
Yeah.
that's who knew us. That's
Yeah.
who was approaching us. And now that we've been doing this, we're about 3.5 years in, almost 4. Now we know a lot more people. Obviously, being in the Bay Area, we know a lot of other companies. We were always looking for a situation which we were able to bring in people. And if you look at our job ads, they always say maybe we have a requirement of PhD plus some years of experience or whatever that could be is in a company. Or we say PhD or equivalent, like something where they have some experience in doing this sort of advanced science that we need to do.
And they would be coming in as, you're recruiting in effect, a new team member, and you have a mandate for them
Yeah.
that you have already designed, or you're looking
Okay,
to...
so it depends on the roles. When we start up new things in-house, whether it's on the sort of discovery side for the approaches, or it's on the translation side for trying to validate and come up with those sort of assets and companies, we do these things in pilots. So we do operate like a company in this way, which is that we're not just going to say, okay, we're going to do this thing for the next 5 years. I will not promise we'll do anything for 5 years. We instead say, look, we're going to try things, and by virtue of actually restricting the time and the people that start a thing, that's how you keep the sort of resources minimal, but allow yourself to do ambitious, innovative things. If you say, oh, I need to decide to do something for 5 years, you end up getting a little bit more conservative because you're like, oh, I don't want to do something for a very long time unless it's like a sure bet or something.
What's the
right?
timeline like then?
Yeah, so for these pilots, it could be anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months. Something like that,
Fun.
like a short pilots, just getting people to start things up and say, let's try this thing and let's kill it fast.
Yeah.
Let's convince ourselves that this is not worth doing, or let's take the riskiest thing and do that first and say, look, if and only if we knock it out of the park with this, does it make sense to do it? We try to de-risk things from that fast. We want the type of generative people that can apply their expertise to new things, come up with ideas and pitch these pilots. We have these sort of, then some managers here, they work directly with me, and we are very well aligned on like exactly what is it that we're trying to aim for, where do we want to make some progress, but then those ideas can be a whole range of places. So for those piloters, they're coming in with, often we will say, here's the thing we know needs to get done, just get their feet wet, because part of it is we don't want people to just import the way they were doing science elsewhere. We're reimagining how do we do science, period.
Yeah.
So we almost don't want them to come in and be like, yeah, come and do your thing. And I almost say, you almost can't come and do your thing.
How do you select against that?
Oh yeah, we basically almost say, come in and understand what we're doing here before you start to even pitch a thing that you want to do. And other areas where we're like, look, we have a thing that is amazing, and we are lacking this expertise, and we need someone to come solve this problem. So we may have someone who has a much more defined thing that we want them to come help contribute. And then it's very clear when we do the recruitment for that role. But other than that, we just say, look, we're not operating like whatever you think. In many cases, people think, oh yeah, I'm going to come and basically be a PI at Arcadia. I'm going to have my research lab at Arcadia.
That's the
not
comfort.
Sometimes I do try to be as blunt as I can during these interviews and say, this is not what we do here. We don't have labs. We don't have lab heads. We have research teams of collaborative independent scientists that do have managers for structural reasons that are also scientists and are very well acquainted with our mission and goals, and that will help keep things on the rails. There is a lot of creativity and generative capacity and freedom that's possible here, but it is not how it looks outside. So sometimes I'll just say, you're not going to have your research lab here, but it will be the most fun place to do science.
Just a step from Arcadia into, if you like, the world of alternative research infrastructure. Have you seen similar models coming up? And or from your experience, do you think that, and this perhaps I'm asking also from a point of view of putting together our thoughts as operators, and have you seen, or do you see a space for PIs choosing to step away from academia, and they've got their own funding, and what you're offering is, if you like, a back-end over. You come here, you've got access to the lab, but also we have a way of helping you do things better, more entrepreneurially.
In my experience, I think people feel pretty reluctant to cut ties or separate from academia, even these other alternative research infrastructures.
Why is that?
Many people keep their academic appointments. We were pretty adamant we will not. Because I think it's very impossible to say, look, we want to cut loose of that the thing that you and I were talking about like how hard it is to get things to move in that space and whatever, and they have their own goals and it's very individually focused and all of these things. So if you now have an alternative organization, I don't know how you say, I'm going to do that thing, but also this other thing that isn't any of those things. But if you still have that and you're still beholden to your students, you're still trying to get them their papers and their jobs and whatever other thing, and you are also trying to say, oh, none of that matters, which one are you? And
unless you give that up entirely.
Unless you give that up entirely and actually just say, that is actually, just have an opinion. Which way do you want to be doing science? I would say that I would hope that people who are looking to leave academia and do those other things, that they actually just take the leap and say, look, if you want to do science in a different way, do it differently then. And it's just do it in a way that would not have afforded you. Once people go into academia, you'll notice that we skew a little bit young. One of the reasons for that is because we don't have like lab heads and things like this. As a PI, I don't mind saying this because I will say it of myself. You get into that type of lab lead role, you are no longer in as close proximity to the science. You're not actively practicing it, right, as much. But also in academia, there is no actual structure or goals in how to manage people. Like, they are traditionally not great managers. So there's
no incentive to do that either, right?
There isn't, exactly.
Because you've got 5 years to...
You have forever, it's a training environment, whatever, it's not really a management situation. So now you have a situation in which you have people who are neither the most leading edge practitioners, nor are they good managers. So they have, in many cases, made it harder for themselves. Here, in many cases, we're looking for people who are practicing the science, and of course they're also generative and have good ideas and whatever.
Is not a traditional entrepreneurial scientist yet, because there's still a lot of discovery to be.
Yes, it's very early stage. And we are trying to figure out how do we actually get ourselves a faster path towards starting companies through more rational science. It does take a different mindset. Even the way in which we go about doing our science, even for us basic scientists, is different. Everyone is thinking a little differently than they were trained. Everyone is doing science a little bit differently than they were trained. Everyone is doing science outside of the very esoteric thing in which they were trained and that they worked on. So it really does require generalists, not just deep specialists. One of the reasons why almost everyone here is a PhD is that we do want that one transferable skill, which is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know and knowing what it feels like to actually be at the forefront of that knowledge of a thing and be able to unearth, like teach yourself these various things. The most valuable thing is the transferable skills you learn in that vein, not so much your esoteric knowledge in some domain. Although once you have that esoteric knowledge, you can bring it to bear on these problems. Even when we build the general capacity in order to do science differently, you don't do that in the abstract. You do that in service of some sort of question or project. So often scientists here will choose to build something out that is in their wheelhouse. So you don't have every dimension of difficulty, right? I'm comfortable in this vein. I've thought very deeply about this problem. And I know that this is a thing that is like a barrier. If we can solve this, not just this problem, but like many others of this shape can be solved for anything that we go after. It's not exactly the way people were used to doing the science outside. We're not a typical incubator where we just, take your pitch and then you spin out your company. The ideas come from outside. In the same way that our companies are beginning our science internally, it's that our way of doing science is different.
Do you come up with the themes then?
There's the big broad theme of our platform, which is how do we actually go about rationally mining the tree of life. That is just like an existing ongoing theme. But then as far as what do we actually go after is a complicated mixture of what the opportunity space is. Because we're trying to generate revenue to fuel this experiment, that means that you do have to care about what would be the downstream customer of this thing. Whether it's a company that would get acquired or the asset that would get licensed or whatever other thing it is. What are the places where us taking our scientific approach can actually solve a problem that isn't already being solved or being solved? That opportunity space is really important. The combination of our edge, the opportunity space, and then the expertise of the scientists we have in-house is what really dictates what areas that we go after.
I realize that we have a hard stop.
Yes,
just
we do.
remember that there is an angle that I think that not very few people have figured out, and quite understandably, which is the funding. And you're, I think, privileged to have
extremely privileged.
been matched with a single with a very forward vision.
Yes.
There are other high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals that are pursuing something similarly.
Yes.
However, my experience has been, apart from some exceptional Eric Schmidt, this kind of individuals, they tend to come up with their own very fixed solutions to what the model or how their money should be used to generate science, which inevitably becomes a very clunky box.
Yes.
That is not a product. It's not a company. It's good to have.
Yeah.
And it's something that we're trying to figure out ourselves, in the sense that, and for a while I've been thinking about the dependency that we have for research to be produced off the back of taxpayers' money. In effect, government funding. And I was realizing how much risk taxpayers are taking, science risk, compared to venture capitalists.
Absolutely.
We take far less risk, and if we are lucky or good at it, we get an upside, we get money back.
That's true.
Taxpayers are getting employment or some social stat goes up, but there's no money flowing back to them.
Yeah, it's good for the economy, right? The federally funded science does have a good return on investment for the economy. And I think all of those things come out and help, hopefully, in the cures and technologies and other things. Like, those are things that are like an unequivocal good to the society. Now, do I think that's happening efficiently? No. Do I think we should be much more responsible with whether it's venture capital or whether it's like whatever other investment there is for science, or even if it's just like a bootstrapped company that is selling a product, because I'm a very open science advocate, just the amount of cash we burn to just take science that is done by the scientists and we pay for it in every single way. So the science is funded by the public. The publishing it in journals is funded by the public by direct costs that are given to the organization, and then having access to that, so the library at the university subscribes to those publications. We're like triple paying for the same thing. And it's unconscionable. The question, though, is it achieving the thing that it's supposed to achieve? You want the utility out of that science. The public is paying for a thing, they should be able to read it and access it, which they can't, which is also unconscionable. But then on top of that, what is the rigor of the science? In my opinion, the rigor of science is not determined when 3 secret people read a paper at the moment that it's dropped. It's determined over time when other scientists operate on it. They can read it, and many more scientists can work on it and test it orthogonally and build upon that. And then whether it stands the test of time is whether it's rigorous science, not what some person decided. The way that it's done now, some person decides, and if they decide that it's not rigorous, then it just goes to some other journal where they just accept it as is. It's not like it's actually doing the thing that it claims to be doing.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Now it's a thing that you're triple paying for, doesn't do the actual job, slows everything down, and belongs to the people who paid for it and that don't have access to it. Everything is wrong with it. This is one of those things where it's just, look, we're going to have to hold ourselves to a higher standard if you're going to take public.
We got to the point where we managed to convince one big donor to withhold any further donations for this year until they have the applicants that have covered a certain set of material to educate themselves on the use of money and achieving impact. It could be our content and maybe other content out there. But it's just as a way of
just
making
holding yourself accountable.
Because otherwise the track record is not positive, and we're not going to be seeing more funding flowing into the ecosystem from other high-net-worth individuals. So
it makes a ton of sense.
The playbook that you're developing is, I love the fact that you're open sourcing that one. And in a way, I think that's very brave, especially because you're a company.
This was one of the things that we wanted to say, too, is that, look, what if we can actually persuade everyone that no matter what sector you are in, how it's done in traditional academic science, but it is also withholding the scarcity mindset that every single thing you do at a company is somehow going to generate value is ridiculous. So it's just like hoarding all of this information for yourself because you might, and it's like anyone who is at a company knows how hard that thing is to do. Hopefully, we can demonstrate that, look, you don't need to hoard this information for credit in this sector, and you don't need to hoard this information for profit in this sector. It is better for all of us, unequivocally, for all of our goals, if we put all of this information out and let other scientists act upon it.
What's the one thing that, if any, that has not worked, that you started off with maybe 3 years ago, and then you realized that...
So many things. I strongly believe in trying to make sure that we capture the uniqueness and the exceptionalism of people in order for the sum to be to the whole be greater than the sum of its parts, right? When you're trying to run an organization, you need coordination, you need something, you need some processes, you need certain things that help row in the same direction, right? And those things are actually needed, but what you don't want to do in a trade-off like that is to reduce the agency and exceptionalism of people. Right? You don't want a watered down, crappier version of everyone. You don't want to create homogeneity, otherwise what's the point? Like, you actually want to somehow make sure that you preserve that autonomy and excellence and uniqueness of what people bring to this thing and still find ways to row together to make progress. And here it's also very difficult because the breadth of science is so big. It's not, again, not a product, not a specific thing where everyone's an expert on the same thing.
Yeah.
They're experts in all sorts of different things.
Yeah.
And then trying to get them to talk to each other and make them understandable to each other is like just a unique challenge. So I would say that we go back and forth between these sort of, that we keep ping-ponging and iterating on these things about structure, autonomy, coordination, like all of these things are like agency is it's so important. Like it's just like, there's no faster way to destroy the soul of a thing than to strip it of its agency.
That's probably the biggest outcome, perhaps from the last 12 months at Wilby has been the fact of, in effect, building something together, but then eventually, which as the founder of the company has been quite difficult because fundamentally I'm no longer in control of the products. And the pleasure of that is that I find myself having to spend time doing other things, but the products are now in control of scientists, in effect, who have joined the organization to challenge the existing academic infrastructure. And so it's great to see that your playbook coming together because loads to learn from and maybe work together.
Thanks so much for what you're doing. I just think it's like unbelievably cool. And this is the thing that's like you're doing that work of actually trying to say like how do we actually make this so that many more people can do this effectively, and that's obviously what we care about too. So many like points of synergy, and always happy to chat more.